On the night of October 2, 1996, AeroPerú Flight Liuling-San, a Boeing 757 operated by Peru's national airline, prepared for what should have been a routine 3-hour flight from Lima to Santiago, Chile, carrying 61 passengers and 9 crew members. Most of them Chilean nationals, but also Peruvians, Mexicans, Britons, a New Zealander, and other Latin Americans, all unaware that they were about to become part of one of aviation's most haunting tragedies. The aircraft itself was only 4 years old, considered modern and safe, and it was flown by 2 highly experienced pilots, Captain Eric Schreiber, aged 58, with decades of flying under his belt, and First Officer David Fernandez, aged 60, both together logging nearly 30,000 flight hours, men who had faced storms, diversions, and emergencies before, yet would find themselves utterly powerless against a hidden, almost invisible mistake that turned their instruments into liars and left them flying blind over a dark ocean. Conditions at Jorge Chávez International Airport seemed perfect for flying. The skies clear with light winds and only a layer of low clouds about 1,000 feet up. The kind of night where flights normally slip away uneventfully into the sky. And indeed, at just after 12:40 a.m., Flight 603 roared down the runway and lifted into the Peruvian night. But almost immediately, First Officer Fernandez noticed something was wrong. The altimeter, the device showing altitude, was stuck on 0. And as Captain Schreiber glanced at his own instruments, saw the same despite being clearly airborne, climbing through the clouds. All 3 altimeters, including the backup, showed no altitude at all, a chilling realization for pilots who were now entering a cloud layer and would soon have no visual reference outside the windows. To make matters worse, their airspeed indicators also began giving conflicting information, with Captain Schreiber asking Fernandez to hold a certain speed, only to notice the reading did not match his own. And then new warnings began flashing: rudder, ratio warnings, Mach trim alerts, overspeed alarms. All systems that rely on the same source of data, all systems now convinced that the aircraft was flying much faster than it truly was. And though the plane's engines and controls were fine, the sensors were feeding false information, leaving the crew to wrestle with contradictory readings in the dark. Realizing the danger of mountains surrounding Lima, Schreiber ordered a turnout over the Pacific Ocean, away from terrain, and instructed Fernandez to declare an emergency, which he did, bringing air traffic control into the loop. Yet even ATC could only help so much. The radar ground speed it provided was accurate, but the altitude data it relayed to the crew came from the very same faulty sensors on board the aircraft, meaning both the pilots and the controller believed the plane was holding around 9,700 feet when in reality it was slowly and silently descending toward the ocean. Inside the cockpit, the pressure was mounting, with the captain and first officer flipping through checklists, trying to diagnose what system failure could cause such chaos. Yet there was no checklist for an aircraft with its static ports completely blocked, and while the overspeed warning continued to blare, the stick shaker, which indicates a stall, activated, sending violent shudders through their control columns, leaving the crew with the maddening contradiction of a plane supposedly flying both too fast and too slow at the same time. First Officer Fernandez, trying to remain calm, suggested asking if another aircraft could fly out and visually guide them back to Lima, but none were available. And so the 2 men pressed on, debating whether to trust the stall warnings or the overspeed alarms, neither willing to fully discard one or the other. While dozens of passengers sat behind them, unaware of the terrifying battle unfolding up front, then came the terrain warnings. Too low terrain, too low. Terrain from the ground proximity warning system, which uses a separate radio altimeter mounted beneath the aircraft to measure height above the surface by bouncing radio waves, a system that was working perfectly and correctly telling them they were dangerously close to the ocean. Yet because the barometric altimeters ATC reports and their own assumptions all suggested they were safely at nearly 10,000 feet, the crew dismissed the radio altimeter readings as false, assuming instead that they had somehow overshot Lima and were now nearing the Andes Mountains to the east. And in that critical moment, they made the worst possible interpretation, continuing to believe the wrong instruments and ignoring the right ones. Still descending, they received contradictory updates from ATC, with controllers saying their speed was about 200 knots. Dangerously near stall speed for a Boeing 757, while the cockpit overspeed alarm insisted they were far too fast, and with stall shakers rattling, rudder ratio warnings sounding, Mach trim cautions flashing, and the terrain alarm repeatedly calling out, the cockpit dissolved into confusion. The captain and first officer, no longer working systematically or supporting each other effectively, both drowning in a storm of false warnings. Each believing different instruments, and both missing the single truth that could have saved them that. Their radio altimeter and stick shaker were the only trustworthy warnings. But human brains under pressure struggle to filter signal from noise. And with 70 lives depending on their judgment, the two men fought a losing battle against bad data until finally, at 1:11 a.m., after 30 agonizing minutes of flying blind, AeroPerú Flight 603 slammed into the Pacific Ocean, left wing first, banking steeply at more than 460 kilometers per hour, killing all on board instantly. And even in that final instant, the captain's altimeter still read 9,700 feet, as if the aircraft were safely cruising high above the sea. The investigation, carried out by Peruvian authorities with support from the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, recovered the black boxes and soon discovered the horrifyingly simple cause. The aircraft's static ports, tiny openings, critical to measuring air pressure and thus altitude and airspeed, had been covered with adhesive tape during maintenance while the plane's nose was polished, and the mechanic responsible forgot to remove the tape before the flight. A mistake that went unnoticed by his supervisors and even by Captain Schreiber. During his pre-flight walk-around, because the tape, gray in color, blended almost seamlessly with the gray fuselage. With the ports blocked, the air data computers could not sense outside pressure, rendering the altimeters and speed indicators useless and filling the cockpit with false alarms. And though the proximate cause was this maintenance error, the final report also pointed to human factors. The captain had failed to respond, act properly to the ground proximity warnings, and ignored the radio altimeter. The first officer had not been assertive enough in challenging his captain to heed the terrain alerts, and bowing itself bore responsibility for not adequately training crews to handle complete static port blockages. An extremely rare but catastrophic failure. The aftermath was devastating, not just for the families of the 70 victims, who eventually received compensation of over $1 million each, but also for AeroPerú itself, which collapsed into bankruptcy by 1999, its reputation destroyed. By the tragedy, while the mechanic who left the tape on the ports was convicted of negligent homicide, his simple oversight having triggered one of the most infamous accidents in aviation history. Today, AeroPerú Flight 603 stands as a chilling reminder that in aviation, even the smallest mistake, a piece of tape the size of a hand, can doom an entire aircraft. And that in moments of cascading system failure, pilots must rely on the right instruments, trust the warnings that are independent of faulty systems. And above all, remember that not all alarms are created equal. For in this case, amid the chaos of false signals, the truth was there all along, quietly flashing on the radio altimeter and shaking through the control column, begging to be heard, while 70 people unknowingly slipped closer to their fate in the dark waters of the Pacific Ocean.